Hello and welcome to Declassified UK. I'm Phil Miller, and today I'm joined by our editor, Mark Curtis. Mark is the author of multiple books on British foreign policy, many of which were endorsed by John Pilger, the investigative journalist who has tragically just passed away on the 30th of December, aged 84, after a remarkable career. Mark, you've known John going back several decades. Can you tell us how you got to know him and how important an influence he's been on your work?
So yes, I have known John for several decades. In fact, what happened when I first met him is that I was a research fellow at Chatham House in my mid-20s, and I'd written a couple of articles that have been published in the Guardian about British arms exports to Indonesia, who at the time were brutally suppressing the independence movement in East Timor. Hundreds of thousands of people had been killed, and Britain was arming the Indonesians. And one day I got a letter, because there were letters in those days. I got a letter out of the blue from John Pilger saying, "I'm actually really surprised that as a research fellow at Chatham House, which is quite a mainstream foreign policy think tank, that you've written these articles in the Guardian critical of British foreign policy." So I was very touched to get a letter from John Pilger. I didn't know at the time, other than through his films and through his articles and his books that I'd been reading for several years. So and it was from that moment on that we kind of struck up a friendship. That I met him soon after that, and we talked about a lot of aspects of British foreign policy. He was knee deep in a lot of film ideas at that time, actually. And a few years later, I think it must have been 2 or 3 years later, he actually did a film about Indonesia, the Timor Conspiracy, it was called. And it was, partly based on our conversations, but really it was based on this amazing research that he'd done and first-hand interviews that he'd got by very dangerously actually going to East Timor to film undercover. I think he and his longtime producer collaborator David Munro secretly got into East Timor posing as people working for a travel firm and interviewed people on the ground about really what was happening there, which was pretty horrendous. And the Timor Conspiracy remains one of John's best films, I think, and one of the most important films. It actually did get a lot of feedback as well among the public. I think I recall that there were thousands of the members of the public that wrote to their MPs on the back of that film to protest against British arms exports to Indonesia. This is middle 1990s. So it was just one example of one of the major impacts that one of John Pilger's films had.
Some of the other investigations that John is particularly well known for is another issue that you've written a lot about as well. The plight of the Chagosians and the US-UK military base on Diego Garcia, and how that community was forcibly expelled from those islands to make way for the military base in exchange for a discount on nuclear submarine technology. Can you tell us a little bit about how you worked with John on that story?
Yes, I think that Stealing a Nation, his film from the early 2000s, I think was a genuinely groundbreaking film, because up to that point, very few people in the UK knew anything about the plight of the Chagosian people, who had been, as you say, forcibly expelled from their homeland by the British in the 1960s and 1970s. And John decided to make a film about their plight, and really brought home to millions, actually, of people for the first time just who these people were, many of whom were in exile in the UK and in other parts of the world, not allowed to return to their islands where many of them had been born. I wrote a booklet for that film with John, describing something of the history of the Chagosians and looking at the declassified files that were available from the archives in London on just how policymakers had completely abused these people. And that really showed the heartlessness and criminality, frankly, of Whitehall policymakers, because what they did was completely illegal. I mean, they created this new territory during a period of decolonization called the British Indian Ocean Territory, which still exists. It was an illegal creation out of several islands. The British just wanted to create a new territory to set up a new military base. But what John did in this film was allow, for the very first time, Chagossian people who had been abused by Britain to speak in public. And that film was broadcast on ITV, mainstream television. So it was seen by a very large number of people. And this is one thing that kind of people possibly forget or never quite knew enough, that most of John's films were broadcast on mainstream television, particularly ITV, who regularly gave him a slot when he produced a film. I'm not sure that could ever happen now. I'm not sure that you could get films so critical of British foreign policy or US foreign policy on mainstream television anymore. But John managed to do that with several of his films, and obviously brought those issues to genuinely millions of people. And for that, he became very, very well known, and that explains a lot of the mainstream impact that I think his films and his other work had.
I remember watching that film, Stealing a Nation, when I was a student. I think I probably watched it on YouTube because John made all of his documentaries available for people to watch. They're still up there. It's a great resource. I advise anyone who hasn't seen them to watch them and go through them all. And that's how I started to come across your work as well, Mark, reading John's books, your books. And it was amazing. I think it was 2016, I was making a film in Sydney about a refugee ship that had been turned back to Indonesia and shipwrecked by the Australian Navy as part of their Stop the Boats policy. And John very kindly gave me and my colleague an interview at his home in Sydney. We had a very lengthy chat about that particular case, but also about the coming war on China, which is something that he's been warning about extensively in what we now know sadly been the last few years of his life, and a warning that looks to be increasingly prescient given what's happening with UK-US posture over Taiwan. I think that was something that for me, when you look back at John's work, obviously I came to it sort of much later than you did. And for someone of perhaps my generation, it's hard to really appreciate just how mainstream he was at his height, and how it was possible in the 70s and 80s to have that kind of mainstream position and be as radical as he was in his work. And you see it when you look at the National Archive files. This is something that our colleague John McAvoy has been highlighting. The way that the Foreign Office was compiling a dossier on him, keeping tabs on John's work. And, they were clearly rattled because he was winning awards like Journalist of the Year. If you look now at the kind of journalists who win those awards, it's a completely different kind of ball game now, the kind of work that's rewarded by the National Media Awards. Is that something that you think explains perhaps some of the more kind of vitriolic reactions that we've seen to his death by certain sections of the media?
Yeah, I'm sure it does, because it is an important point, actually, that he did make his career in the mainstream, and in fact wrote for most of his career, apart from in the last few years when he was pretty much banned from writing in the mainstream. He wrote for the mainstream, beginning in the 1960s, when The Mirror was one of the world's biggest selling daily tabloid newspapers. John, reported from Vietnam and from Southeast Asia for The Mirror for years, and got a huge audience and became a well-known name. As you're saying, when you look at the media now, and this is something that we at Declassified are looking at all the time, when you look at the media now, there's what John actually called in an AMA with us last year, the closing down of spaces. That's what he called it. When I asked him actually in our AMA, what's the biggest difference between the media now and the media when you were starting out as a journalist? And he said it's the closing down of spaces to critical independent voices in the mainstream. It would be impossible now, I'm sure, for a John Pilger to get a place on a mainstream print media outlet in the UK, or maybe actually in the US and Australia as well. Things have got worse. They've gone backwards. This is something that, as I say, that we see every day at Declassified. And it's worth remembering that as well as exposing British, US, Australian policies, John also spent a large amount of time in research in his career exposing how the rest of the media that he worked for worked, and that was something that many people admired, and I was very much one of them, because he was one of those mainstream journalists who was prepared to spill the beans on how the system worked around him, and for that he incurred the wrath of a lot of journalists, particularly in the Murdoch press, who John attacked many times for failing to report accurately and independently, and other journalists as well, who frankly John exposed simply by doing the work that they should be doing, by telling the truth. He exposed many other journalists for not telling the truth. So he showed them up simply in the act of reporting accurately and properly. And that's one of his greatest legacies, I think, that he both directly showed millions of people how the rest of the mainstream worked, and kind of lived that in his actual reporting.
And I think it's fair to say, Mark, that one of the reasons that you set up Declassified was to try and carry on this legacy of the type of work that John did throughout his life. And like you say, in the last year or so, year and a half, we were lucky enough to have two kind of interviews with him that we recorded and put out on our channel. One of them talking about this change that you just mentioned in the UK media landscape, from this kind of golden era of investigative journalism, before the Sunday Times was bought by Rupert Murdoch, before, while World in Action was still a major TV series, and there was funding for this genuinely independent television that John built so much of his career through. And the other discussion that we had in May, which I think was actually sadly possibly the last recorded kind of interview that he gave, was a conversation I had with him and Consortium News about the work that we'd both been doing on depleted uranium. This was an issue that John had exposed during the first Gulf War, and I'd also been looking at its use in Kosovo and now in Ukraine. So I recommend anyone watching this video, if you haven't seen those two already, I'll put the links up at the end. Please check them out, and please, if you can, support Declassified's work so that we can try and, in our own small way, carry on John's legacy.
Yeah, and it's certainly true, Phil, that John did inspire me to set up Declassified, because the two things that we are trying to do, above all else, is to tell the truth about the UK's role in the world, and to expose how the British media, mainstream media, national media, fail to tell the truth about Britain's role in the world. Those are our two goals, and that's what John kind of dedicated his professional career to. His film, The War You Don't See, is another one that's really worth watching, even though it's more than a decade old. In fact, it's probably more than 2 decades old. I can't quite remember how far back it goes. It's about the war in Iraq. And it was a study, really, of how the media are the enablers of our wars, and how the Iraq war would never have happened had it not been for the British mainstream media facilitating the state's attack on Iraq. If mainstream journalists had spoken out about the lies that were being spoken and about the obvious falsehoods and propaganda that the British government and the US governments were putting out at that time, surely the war wouldn't have gone ahead. And I think you can look now at British policy towards Gaza and say, if British journalists were now documenting, as we are Declassified are trying to document, the British military role, the British diplomatic role in the support of Israel, then the British government simply wouldn't be able to get away with the extent of its support for Israel's brutality in Gaza. So it's very much incumbent on us journalists to report the truth in the public interest. And that I think was always John's motivation, actually. It was to support the public interest against this monolithic, or fairly monolithic, elite media that were really out for themselves